Okay, our guest today for the second part of our series on the history of the behavior analysis program at the University of Florida is Professor Emeritus Marc Branch, who many of you know. Marc is another individual who I am very fortunate to say served as one of my professors when I was a student here, and then later as a close colleague for many years, and we're thrilled that he's accepted our invitation to come and present to the group today. I'll be asking him a few questions or making some comments, and he will respond based on his recollections. The first question that I wanted to ask him about was related to his decision to come to the University of Florida. Marc, if you could describe the events leading up to that decision.
Sure, this may be a longer story than you care to hear about, but it's got some twists and turns in it. Where I was an undergraduate was one of the few places in the country that was early in on the behavior modification, behavior therapy bandwagon. And so I was a student there, and I got on that bandwagon. So I was interested to go in graduate school in clinical psych. And by another story that I'll skip, I wound up at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, which at the time, when I got there, I discovered was called Fort Skinner in the Desert. And so I was going to be in the clinical program there. First year there, you didn't do any clinical stuff. Back in the old days, you had to take general psych for a year. So advanced psych, history and stats and learning and social and those kinds of things. And then the fun part was at the end of the first year, there was a one all-day written exam to determine if you were going to be allowed to come back the next year. Half the people didn't make it. So the next year it starts clinical, and they had hired a new clinical director and two new clinical faculty because the previous clinical director, you may be familiar with the name Dr. Joel Greenspoon. He's famous for the experiment. I don't know whether you can remember that. That was way back when, where he went into a psychotherapy session, and whenever the person said, I think it was some kind of, anytime I said noun, he'd go, The nouns went way up. And he would stop, and they would drop down. Anyway, he was famous for that. But he had left, so they needed a new clinical director. And it turns out they had decided to revamp the clinical training program, which when I got there had like 4 required courses. Half the clinical students did their dissertations in animal labs, so it's a little bit unusual place to begin with. And so the first course that was standardly taught in clinical in those days is a course on assessment. That's where you read the research behind IQ tests, MMPI, for all the different kinds of tests. They weren't called instruments, so they were called tests. And so we go through that, and one of the things we discover is the literature is quite compelling that projective tests like the Rorschach are unreliable, therefore invalid, they're invalid, they're worthless. So the new clinical curriculum comes out, and it's going to include 2 semesters to learn how to give and score projective tests. I'd say, well, these people don't even believe their own data. So I went over down to the office of the experimental program director and said, can I switch? I'll never forget, he said, we've been expecting you, Marc. He said, here, read this. And he handed me a hard copy of Sidman's book, which is the main book that changed my life. To read that book was like, wow, this all makes incredible sense. So I switched over to basic in the animal lab and tried to move ahead. But in the meantime, there was a large faculty conflict about the faculty hadn't voted as a faculty on the new clinical program, so there was a big fight about this. And then when they finally did vote on it, they voted it down. And the 3 new clinical people went to the dean, who overruled the faculty. So 9 faculty left that year. Most of the behavior analysis people. One who stayed was a new assistant professor, a guy named Peter Colleen. I believe is the current president of ABBA. But That's another great story. The greatest job talk ever given was his. At least certainly that I ever saw. So I followed one of the professors. So I started, where you go? One of the professors went to the University of Maryland, a guy named Fred Heggie. So I was always, he was the director of my master's thesis project. And so followed him to the University of Maryland. And after a year there, he left to go work at Walter Reed. So I wound up with Dr. Louis Golub, who was B.F. Skinner's last PhD. And so I'm in the direct Skinner line because he supervised my dissertation. And that's also where I got introduced directly to behavioral pharmacology. I'd had a course at Arizona State in behavioral pharmacology by another famous guy, John Falk, of adjunctive behavior fame. It was a pretty good faculty there, actually. Rick Scholl was there, Aaron Brownstein, a lot of good people were at Arizona State. I just missed Jack Michael, who had left the year before to go to Western Michigan. But anyway, so that's how I got in the behavioral pharmacology business and learned a good bit of that from Lou. And of course, I learned a little bit about being a good behaviorist since he was right in the Skinner line. And in my last year, started dissertation. These are long experiments. It got a couple of years to collect enough data, basic research. You run 40 sessions per condition, all this crazy stuff, so it takes forever. And so I was well on my way to dissertation. The last year I was going to be there. In the fall, I got wind of a possible job out at UCLA and the Brentwood VA hospital. So I went out there to interview for a position that was going to be half to set up a conditioning behavioral pharmacology lab in the basement of the VA and half time upstairs in one of the first token economies in a VA ward in the United States. So I was going to be basic and applied both, which seemed a pretty good mix to me. So I was offered that position, so I stopped looking for a job. Well, lo and behold, it gets around to about, April or May, and it turns out there's a big political blow up at the VA. And the head psychiatrist who had hired me is leaving. So there is no job. So then I had to scramble looking around, and I was lucky enough to get a NIMH postdoc at the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology, which was actually famous for, that's where a lot of the early work on developing birth control had occurred. And so they had a lot of money to hire people. So they actually had a biopsychology kind of program there. And I went to work with this fellow named James McKerney, who was a well-known rising star in behavior analysis and was one of the lead dogs. He's also a behavioral pharmacology kind of guy, but he's also one of the lead dogs on this crazy phenomenon that you may or may not have heard of since nobody could figure out what it was. That you could train squirrel monkeys to respond, to give you beautiful fixed interval patterns of behavior when the consequence was a fairly intense electric shock to the tail. Shock maintained behavior. And so I learned a little bit about that, learned more about, and one of the things I learned how to work with non-human primates, which I think probably helped me out in the long run. So it was a 2-year postdoc, so I was planning on staying there 2 years, but I did, unless there were plum jobs out there, and there were 2 jobs that looked like plum jobs my first year. I'd only been there a few months. One was at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and the other was here. So, I sent in my materials to both places. Well, I never heard a word from UF. I actually made it for an interview. I got down to the last 2 at North Carolina and was edged out by Linda Dykstra. And I don't know if you know anything about behavioral pharmacology, she's turned out to be a pretty big star. She's terrific. She's a wonderful woman, too. In fact, I did a postdoc in her lab, sabbatical in her lab in 1981. She's a terrific person. So I figured, well, okay, and then I'll start keeping my eyes open next fall, right? And so it comes around, I think it was in May, actually. McKerney got a phone call from Michael Zeiler, who was then the editor of JAD, saying that the Florida job had not been filled. They interviewed some people and they didn't like any of them. So I said, oh, good, I can apply for it. I'll be ready to apply again in the fall. By that time, my Vita was starting to fatten up a little bit, had a few more publications. So McKerney, this is what happens, you get lucky. said, I think you should send them some stuff now so that you keep your name in front of them. I said, okay, I'll do that. So I put together my better looking CV and a letter, and bragged about how I spent every week I got to go to a seminar with the godfather of behavioral pharmacology, Peter Dews at Harvard, and there were some other great people, Bill Morris and Roger Keller, Larry Bird were all there. And we used to meet once a week over at the New England Primate Center. So you name dropped, I did all that kind of stuff. Well, it worked. Because 3 days after I sent it off, I get a phone call about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's some guy named Ed Malagotti. We were on the phone 3 hours. Boy, did we hit it off. We were all interested. Turned out he was doing some shock maintained behavior. The only other guy in the country who was doing it. And plus he was interested in adjunctive behavior, and I knew what that was. It was pretty. So actually at the end of the phone call, he invited me down. And then there's a great story that would take another 20 minutes to tell about how I managed to get hired, but I did. And so I showed up the following September. This UF was on a quarter system then. So school started in September. The fall quarter started in September. So I showed up in September of 1973. And somehow stayed here until I retired in 2012. Never left. That's how I got here. So as you can see, there are bumps and luck and all kinds of things sort of determine where you wind up.
Yeah, a lot of luck for all of us too, I guess. So you mentioned your background in behavioral pharmacology. Could you talk a little bit about the development of the behavioral pharmacology lab that you directed here at UF?
Yeah, there actually is a story that goes with that too. I'm not sure. Brian's probably heard it. I don't know whether Jesse's heard it or not. But I was hired. The position was actually advertised as a behavioral pharmacology job. That they were building the behavior analysis program. Ed and Hank and a couple other people were trying to put together a behavior analysis group, and they had just gotten just a couple of years before behavior analysis established as an independent program in the department, separate from experimental, which was going cognitive. And so that's how that developed. So I came down and interviewed for the job. I get the job and negotiate what I thought was the spectacular package, $15,000 to start up in 1973. I don't know how much that's worth now, but it's way more than $15,000. So that was the good news. The bad news is I got here and they didn't have the money. Oops. So I didn't know what kind of job I was ever going to get. So when I left graduate school, I had for myself one thing called a relay rack, which was the apparatus that we used to use to control experiments. I had one of my own and a whole bunch of old equipment that Golub had let me have. And I had built one pigeon operant conditioning chamber. And boy, I ran my dissertation in it, and every experiment run in that chamber turned out great. It was sound, the walls were like this thick. So I was going to be able to do something, So I wasn't too non-play, because I thought, I might wind up at a small school. I'd get one relay rack and I'd have mine. And so I wasn't crushed by the fact, but it certainly put a clinker in. But then good fortune drops in again. I was scheduled to teach, one of the 2 courses I was scheduled to teach that term was Psych 420, which was the undergraduate pigeon lab, which I think nobody had run for a while. It was on the books. And so it turns out, we get here, I'm just getting here, and it turns out it's under-enrolled. Not enough people are enrolled in it. It was always a small class, but even for that, it was under-enrolled. So to do me a favor, the department chairman, a guy named Merle Mile, canceled the course. Look, you got to get started trying to put your little micro lab together. It turns out that course, because it had a writing requirement, and it was a lab course, satisfied a college requirement for taking a lab. I think every student at UF at that time had to take some kind of one lab course somewhere in their undergraduate. So the vice president for academic research, Dr. Robert Bryan, calls Dr. Meyer and said, what's up with canceling a course that fulfills a requirement? He says, well, we don't have the equipment. And Brian says, of course, the room was filled with equipment. So that was a little bit of a fishtail. And Brian said, we're not canceling the course because you don't have any equipment. How much do you need? Merle calls me up in my office. He says, can you get me a budget? Of course, I'd already written a budget for the basement at UCLA. So I had a budget. I said, yeah, I can get it down to you in 5 minutes. What I need to buy. I need to buy a computer. I need to buy these boxes. I need to blah, blah, blah. So I give it to him. He sends it over to Brian. Brian sends over the money. So I get to buy my lab. There's a miracle. So suddenly, instead of having one relay rack, I have a newfangled item. It's called a mini computer, which meant it was smaller than a room. Actually, it was actually fairly small. You'll enjoy this. It was a relay. You mounted it on a relay rack. It was about this wide, it's about that deep, and about that thick. And it had because I overextended, it had 8K of memory. How about that? With 8K of memory, we could run 10 independent experiments at the same time, in real time, operant conditioning experiments, where things are happening all over the place. That's when you learn computers can do stuff really fast. It was a little clunky, it was big. That's why Bill Gates, I think, famously once said, no one will ever need more than 640K. Apparently that didn't work out. Now we got terabytes in a machine. But anyway, that's how the lab got going. And this was just the right program for me for the kind of behavioral pharmacology I was in. Behavioral pharmacology is sort of a blend of pharmacology and behavior analysis. There's a more broad field called psychopharmacology, which is sort of drugs that influence behavior from all kinds of perspectives. But the behavioral pharmacology idea is if you can get precise control over behavior, which you can with operant techniques, then you can make more clear statements about what the drug's effects are on behavior. And there are exciting, just incredibly dramatic early findings, still unexplained, about how the conditions of the behavioral conditions of these procedures can have a huge impact on how the drug influences the behavior. The sort of the most towards it, there are all kinds of demonstrations that simply changing the schedule of reinforcement, if you do it just right, from fixed interval to fixed ratio, you can change a drug from the stimulant to a depressant just by changing the schedule, not by changing the drug. So suddenly you can turn amphetamine into a depressant and pentobarbital into a stimulant. For me, that was really amazing kinds of stuff. It still amazes me. And it's still the kind of stuff that not very many people are pursuing that particular avenue. My avenue was to pursue a domain in which it was very clear that behavioral factors make a big difference, and that's in drug tolerance. Whether or not at least organisms in highly controlled operant conditioning environments get tolerant or not can depend on reinforcement scheduling, stimulus presentation issues. And I was interested in untangling those. Got lucky. The Army at the time, for some strange reason in the 70s, got interested in marijuana. I can't figure out why it was, except that half the troops were smoking it. And so I got some money to do some THC work on tolerance. Actually, THC produces massive tolerance in non-humans. There's not a whole lot of work, I think, in humans, but you get gigantic. It's almost as big as you get with opiates, which is pretty large. And then actually later in my life, I got interested in cocaine because cocaine whether you get tolerant to cocaine can depend on behavioral factors. And that was the kind of stuff we pursued for the rest of the time I was here with a whole bunch of really great graduate students. And of course, in behavioral pharmacology, it turns out that the National Institute on Drug Abuse somehow populated its upper echelon with a lot of people who are sympathetic to behavior analysis. So behavior analysts got a good chance to get some money. So for most of my career, I was able to get the research supported by NIDA. But actually, in my own work, about half of what I published didn't have anything to do with pharmacology. It's all just basic EAB research. The other half was this drug tolerance issue, first with marijuana and then with mainly cocaine. Learn some important things. You learn what the profit margin is on cocaine when you work with it. When I first started, you could get these kind of drugs directly from the drug manufacturers. They would send it to you for free. Tell you I'm a research scientist. I need like 10 grams, which will last like 2 years for cocaine. And then they stopped doing it when cocaine got to be a little more recreational, popular, and became a drug that people were worried about. And so the next time I tried to get some, Merck, the company Merck was the company that made most of the cocaine in the United States. And they would only sell me a pound. For those of you who've forgotten, a pound is 454 grams. A dose, a good human dose, is about 10 milligrams. How much they wanted for a pound? They're making a profit, $32. That's about $500,000 worth of cocaine you can buy for $30. So I didn't want that in my life. That's too dangerous. For a while, I had to get it. I got it through the clinical people down in shams because at that time, cocaine, it may still be, it's actually a topical anesthetic of choice in throat surgery because it's vasoconstricting. And apparently it's especially effective in the throat. So it had a legal use, so they had it. So I could buy it down there. Not a pound at a time. And shortly after that, NIDA actually started making their own. And so then you could get it for free. So that's sort of the history of the behavioral pharmacology lab.
Earlier you mentioned your colleague, Ed Malagodi. Many of the students in the program in the present day did not know Ed. Could you talk a little bit about his influence on the program, maybe some of his empirical and conceptual work?
Sure, I guess as I look back, Ed was sort of the heart of the program for a long time. He was the guy who became a behavior analyst because he read the book Science and Human Behavior on his own, and it converted him on the spot to that particular approach, a behavioristic approach, but a radical behavioristic approach, not a methodological behavioristic approach, which I don't know whether you guys still learn that distinction. But if you haven't, ask somebody. He knows, and so does he. And so does he back there. Those guys back there know too. But Ed early on, I think he was like the first operant conditioning hire in the department. I think at the behest of Hank, who thought we should have an operant conditioner. Hank was mainly a classical conditioner when he got here, did classical conditioning with monkeys. He had Cebus monkeys. Those are way too smart for what I wound up with squirrel monkeys here for a while. But Ed's dissertation work, which he followed up, was doing token reinforcement in rats, where he would actually train rats to earn marbles that they could trade in for food pellets. How about that? So he was a sort of a condition reinforcement guy. Part of his research program sort of followed that up with the study of second order schedules, which are schedules in which brief stimuli are interposed at different places as a consequence of responding. And there are lots of arguments about how much condition reinforcement is going on in there. And he was also had some squirrel monkeys. And he had some monkeys shocking themselves. We're not sure they were doing it happily, but they were doing it. And so he did some work in that domain. But he was really the complete radical behaviorist in terms of, he taught all the Skinner-based courses. He taught it was called the Skinner course, I guess. I don't know what there's. And he also taught verbal behavior. He was pretty deep into that stuff. And actually, verbal behavior plays an actual major role in trying to understand behavior in general as a radical behaviorist. We know about private events, mainly on the basis of verbal behavior. Good old B.F. Skinner, channeling Ludwig Wittgenstein, by the way, probably by accident. I don't think he stole it. figured out the only possible ways you could ever learn to talk about that stuff. How can you talk about what you're thinking, what you're imagining? How do you learn how to do that when nobody can see what it is you're doing? It's a tricky question. Skinner had some reasonable answers. So he was certainly, and of course, he was a piece of work as a person. You talk about a unique individual. Chain smoker. So when they outlawed smoking in the classrooms, he would teach in this classroom. He needed to smoke a couple cigarettes, so he would lecture for a few minutes, then step out into the hall, take a drag, come back in.
Actually, he would smoke in the class,
Yes.
line up his bus vertically on the desk.
Yeah, there'd be 4 or 5 of them. The only chain smoker I ever saw like that in class was actually Gordon Bauer when I was, I think, a sophomore in college. He was a young assistant professor, and he would smoke 4 Lark cigarettes in one class, routinely. I had a class with him 2 years later. He was a superstar on the rise. He was a full professor 2 years later. And he didn't smoke at all. So maybe once he got the full professor, it took the pressure off him. But Ed was, you got to be careful if you decide to go with lunch with Ed, because you might not get home till 2 a.m. He was, he had a few, he loved dives. So he'd go to some dive bar where you could get some munchies. Next thing you know, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You've had about 45 beers. And he was a really interesting guy. He had his first heart attack when he was 38. With me driving him to the doctor. It was the year, I think it's the first or second year I was here. He started having chest pains, and he says, "We can't figure this out. Next time you have one, get over here." So we're at lunch. This one didn't go till 2 a.m. Did for him because he was in the hospital after I took him there. That's lots of stories about Ed.
Yeah, we probably could be here till 2 a.m. This seminar is the seminar everyone calls 622, although it has not had that numeric label in many years. But could you tell a little bit about your recollection of the history of this seminar?
Yeah, when I got here, I don't think it was a course. It was just a regular practice by the behavior analysis group to meet every Wednesday, right after lunch, I think, somewhere in there, and for people to talk about their data, present it, or everybody'd read the journal clubby, everybody'd read the same article, and we'd have a discussion about it, that kind of thing. And at some point, somebody got the good idea, hey, we could make this a course. And then somebody could get course credit. And so that happened shortly after I got here. And it was PSY 622 before we went to the screwball system that we have now. So it's always easier to remember 622 because it took us all like 6 or 7 years to memorize 6937. Is it still that?
Yes.
It was PSY, EAB. Every subdivision in psych has its own 10,000 number possibility. Common course numbering, that's what it was supposed to do. What it made is made sure that every university, no university had the same number on the same course ever again, because there were so many available. So you could say, this is the only place in the state you can get this. But everybody was there always, and it evolved in what I think is a nice way. In fact, it sort of became, I think it's sort of the glue that held the program together through thick and thin. Is that every Wednesday, all the people got together, so you found out what people were doing over the course of the year. The class was actually usually a really good source of ideas about how you were screwing it up, how you could do it better. So that's those of us who've been here have at least, I think, have a warm spot in the heart. Not as warm for students, but you felt the heat.
You alluded to teaching the undergraduate lab course. So I recall that for many years you were associated with that course, either teaching it yourself or your graduate students teaching it. Could you describe the format of the course, including some of the expectations for students?
Yeah, when I got here, it was a 5-credit quarter course. 5 credits meant 5 days a week. But just to show that we were mean, it was 2 hours each day for 5 days a week. So it's always in the late afternoon. And it was in room 130, where I guess it's, if it were to be resurrected, it's where it still would be. And the general format, at least as I taught it, I think most graduate students, I'm not sure, Tim Hackenberg taught it some too. And so he may have done it slightly differently, but it was sort of and if I get this wrong, Dr. DeLeon could correct me because he was a student I took the class. And that is that, were we on semesters by the time you took it? I think,
Yeah.
Actually, it worked a little better as a semester course. You really had to pack, quarters are only 10 weeks. So, in fact, I think maybe for a while we did it over 2 quarters, which was a little bit too long. It was 20 weeks, 16 weeks was better. But mainly it was two projects. Students worked in groups of 2 or 3. It varied over time, depending on how much equipment we had. And so there were sort of 2 major projects during the term. The first was what I always like to call the canned experiment. This was an experiment that we had outlined the design of as the professors. And that's the experiment in which actually probably the most important part for getting people excited about behavior analysis is training your pigeon to peck a key through shaping. You can see it. You know, when things are simplified, they're a lot easier to see. And the operant conditioning environment is pretty barren. There's not a whole lot of extra stuff going on there. That's why sometimes I think it's a miracle that those kinds of arrangements that we call reinforcement actually work with all these when you're out in the real world with lots of variables over which have zero control operating. So it's pretty powerful kind of effect. So first part of the camp, you got to be able to get your pigeon to do something. So students do that, and then took right off from there. We had 2 or 3 canned experiments, changed from every few years just to keep ourselves from being bored. And but that was the experiment when we started to learn the day-to-day techniques of behavior analysis work. You collect data every day. You plot your data every day. Of course, we had cumulative response recorders, so we could have cumulative records. You filed those every day. You couldn't start the next day until you showed your graph that was up to date of where you were. So you just learn it so that you're monitoring your data as you go rather than all their other courses where you collect a whole bunch of data and then you stick in the computer to see if anything happened. Of course, I may have more to say about that later too. And that students were asked to, what we did, we tried to sort of mimic what it's like for a regular scientist. It was a written lab report, publication format lab report as part of that first experiment. And so we did it the way we were the journal editors. So you would submit your paper and it would come back with editorial comments suggesting changes, usually by the millions. That's what the students will tell you. Because, most of them have never written anything like this before. Just getting all the stuff in the right sections is not that straightforward as it turns out. And then we send it back. We give you a preliminary grade, which is usually not very good because people, kill themselves to write these reports and then they get back, okay, you're up to 40 out of 100. But you could have 2 revisions and then you were done. So you got to revise it twice. So by the end of that, people usually had a chance to produce something that looked pretty credible. And of course, you get to keep your best grade at the end. You weren't stuck with your 40. And then the second experiment, each group devised its own independent project. During that time, we used to read we'd read mainly JAB type articles one a week to get people familiar with certain kinds of research questions. And sometimes people just want to follow up the first experiment, which is how life often works. And others say, well, I like this, and you were free to do a replication. In fact, encouraged to do so because we're trying to teach the world replication is a good thing for science. They would do that. They would figure out the parameters, what data they're going to collect, how they're going to analyze them, how they're going to present them. And then we would have a convention on the last day of class where each group would present its project. And then we'd all go over, in those days, when we first started, the drinking age had been dropped to 18, because if you were old enough to die in Vietnam, you're old enough to drink in college. So we'd go over to the Orange and Brew, does that place still exist?
There's a new one.
There's a new one.
Yes.
But anyway, you go over there and drink beer. I said, this is the way you do science. Right? You go and you give your presentation at a meeting, and then you go drink beer or something else. So that was the arrangement of the class, and it sort of, I think, operated sort of like that for most of the years. Might have been some variations. I guess if I ever see Tim Hackenberg, I can ask him what he remembers doing in there. We had to change the apparatus a few times. When I started, we had a little relay rack in each room. Ended, we had a little PC in each room. So changed what runs the stuff.
Okay. Well, you alluded to this next topic a few minutes ago. We'd like to hear your perspective on inferential statistics.
Well, they probably know my general perspective.
I think most know the general perspective. Maybe you could.
Well, when I first started graduate school, I had statophilia. I thought stats were the greatest. And, in fact, I remember I was at Arizona State. I had a fellowship, an NDA fellowship, so I didn't have a TA-ship. I volunteered to TA stat, and they allowed me to do it. I don't know whether the feds like that or not. So I was really into that stuff. But I learned a few good things from doing that. A couple of them that sort of stand out is one you learn one when you first take stat, when you first take inferential statistics. Somewhere you hear, well, if you increase the n, you're more likely to get significance. What? Isn't that a little fishy? But you say, well, everybody's doing it, so what do I care? But I did learn also there, one of the important things I learned actually this at Arizona State while I was there about stats from TAing it, and also taking a fairly unconventional quote stats course in the second semester there. It's actually a course in curve fitting, which you get if you take chemistry as a way to analyze data, but usually not psych. But I learned that the null hypothesis doesn't have to be nothing. You can actually make the null hypothesis what you predict. You can actually flip the arrangement. Then if you get statistical significance, it means you were wrong, or at least supports the idea you were wrong. Actually, it doesn't support it very well, though, because just like it doesn't support very well that you think you got something when you do get statistical significance. But as I told you, Sidman's book was a revelation to me. I mean, I still have my hardback copy, taught the methods course a bunch of times, enjoyed reading it every year. So I was very happy with, here's a way to do research. I don't have to worry about, is that fudging? So it's really, and I had a sabbatical in 1981 at UNC with Linda Dykstra. And while I was there, so I had time to do some sort of stat reading, and I ran across a paper by this guy named Ronald Carver. This is in the Harvard Educational Review. It had been published in '78, called "The Case Against Significance Testing." And another revelation. Oh my God, This has been a nutso idea from the start. And it's so easily misinterpreted that how little you actually learn from a test of, and actually how stupid an idea it is most of the time to have the famous nil hypothesis. That is, that there's nothing going on in the world but chance. If that's not true, then a p-value is meaningless if that's not true. It only has meaning if the null hypothesis is in fact the true case. That's why it's actually sort of useful if you're into quality control, where you expect, you're making dice and you expect them to be, fair. And so you take them out and you roll them a couple hundred times and see how they do. And so that'll give you some estimate of what you would expect if it were fair. But that's not nothing. You're predicting exactly what it will do. And that's what happens if you do curve fitting. You're hypothesizing at the very least that it's going to be this shape of curve. So my general impression is that after I came back in 1981, all the graduate students in the department got my 2 cents worth about what's wrong with significance testing for a while, because they all had to take the behavior analysis pro-sem, as it was called. So all the students got it. And of course, then later, the privileged few, known as the behavior analysis students, got my 2 cents worth. And so there's been some actual movement in the last couple of decades. The problems with significance testing were pointed out in the 40s. And then on now, then there was a major psych bulletin paper in 1960, and then, showing, wait a minute, this is what you guys are doing. Can't you see what the problem is here? It's not telling you what you want to know. You want to know whether you should believe what I tell you, but it doesn't give you any guidance on whether you should believe that. And it certainly doesn't give you any quantitative advice like, wow, 001, only 1 in 1,000 that you're wrong. Incorrect. You don't know whether the chances are that you're wrong. It doesn't matter what the significance. So I guess about 2016, the American Statistical Association came out with a short paper. They had appointed a panel of eminent statisticians to talk about misunderstanding of p-values. And so, now remember, this is written by statisticians who have a big stake in this business. And still, they pointed out clearly all the weaknesses. It's not p-value isn't the probability that the results are due to chance. Sorry, that's incorrect. P-value is the inverse of that, is not the probability of replication. It has no predictive influence on the likelihood that the result is repeatable. It doesn't tell you any of that stuff, and everybody thinks it does. In fact, some textbooks used to actually say that by mistake. I don't know whether I've been out of the game now for 8 years, so I don't know whether there was. I think when I left, there was one textbook pointed out to be my gallery that actually at least explained the weaknesses of significance testing. I don't know whether there's another textbook yet like that.
That I know of.
Not that you know of. So, but just having one is progress. And I have seen some other, what I call indicators. The only thing I still get, I get JAB, so it doesn't count. And I get science. I still get science. And I'm seeing more and more bar graphs without asterisks, anywhere near them, and with dot plots inside them. So you can see every measured individual, which for me, I think it's at least some sort of advancement. And most journals have made some sort of statement now, including in the biomedical sciences, that significance tests are not required You don't have to pass some actually meaningless threshold to get stuff published. But boy, this is like I used to talk about trying to deal with university administration. I spent 5 years as chair, and that is trying to melt an iceberg with a Bic lighter. You get enough Bic lighters and you do it long enough, you can melt some of the iceberg. But I think that may be where we are with significance testing. There was actually, I guess, last year or two in the American Statistician, the whole issue was related to what do we do when we give this up? Because the people who published the first paper were astonished it had so little effect. It's like the National Academy of Sciences had nothing to say about it. Here it is. Wait a minute, we've been doing this wrong for 45 years. Nothing. So far as I know, still nothing. But the editorial boards of most journals have made statements. Actually, it's been a little bit of a rub for me that Jay Abbott, I don't know what this is happening with Java, seems to be trending the other direction. We've been doing it right for all these years. We're the leader of the pack. Don't backtrack. But, it's a huge industry. I mean, the stat textbook has to be $1 billion industry. And of course, without everybody having to take stats courses, what happens to stat departments? Oops. They would shrink. So there are a lot of impediments. It's trying to get health care in a country where the insurance companies control access to health care. It's a huge, there are hundreds of thousands of people who work in the insurance industry. You just can't get rid of them. And that's even though they don't have tenure. So we'll see what happens. So that's sort of my general thoughts. We'll see what happens. Don't expect anything to happen fast. Because
We'll get out our Bic lighters. So one final question. Let's get this on the record. What is in the holiday branch punch?
Well, I'm happy to take credit for it, but I don't deserve the credit for it. Actually, the person who found this, and it's a found recipe. This is actually a recipe with a real name you can Google. It's a guy named Mike Gardner, who was a student of Ed Malagoti's. At one Christmas, we always had some kind of get-together on Christmas, a few drinks, people bring in some food. And he made it, the punch is, it has two different names. You can Google either strip and go naked, or skip and go naked is the name of the punch. And it's a simple punch. It only has 3 ingredients. It has lemonade concentrate, beer, which I believe should be cheap beer. Don't put your good stuff in there. And alcohol. Now, how much alcohol you put in depends on what kind of alcohol you're pouring in. When we first started, we had lab alcohol, 100%, well, actually 95%. We had 190 proof alcohol upstairs with the biopsych people, so we would get essentially pure ethanol. But that makes it easy to control the proof. Because when you pour the beer's about, 10 proof maybe on average. Cheap beer's probably 10 proof, 5% maybe. So you know how much alcohol you got. Now you try to get the punch up to somewhere around when you're still measuring it at the beginning of the party. Try to get it up around 40 proof, because if you do that, you can't taste the alcohol. It's completely invisible. So people just keep chugging the stuff down. Next thing you know, everybody's feeling pretty good. And then the later batches are less precisely measured. But you can figure out the proof. If you've got cheap vodka's fine, because vodka is basically water and alcohol. That's all it is. And so that's 40%, right? 80 proof. Or you can get Everclear's what? About 150? So it's about 75% alcohol. do that. Or if you know somebody at a lab somewhere, you can get 95%. Don't use the 100% because it's not 100%. Because it's not stable at 100%. So they pour a little benzene on top, like a 0.1%. Too much benzene is not good for you. But if you did it, actually probably wouldn't hurt you if you did it once a year. But the party has evolved. It's tamer than it used to be. It used to start it right after lunch and go till about 2 or 3 in the morning. People brought a ton of food. Everybody brought. So it was potluck. Everybody chipped in money to buy the beer. And the alcohol was free when we started, so that was a good price. And like I said, there are variations. You can use pink lemonade or you can use yellow lemonade, concentrate. But you just make the lemonade, instead of using water, you use beer. And the big frozen concentrate cans are 12 ounces, which is, interesting enough, the same amount in most beer cans. So you don't even have to measure it into the can. If you're making regular lemonade, you fill the can up 3 times, pour it in, mash it around. Here, you just take 3 beers and then season it up to taste. Anyway, I don't deserve any. Maybe I deserve credit for maybe I will remember 3 ingredients. And at my age, remembering anything gets to be important.
Well, we appreciate that you took that question as seriously as we are about out of time, but please join me in thanking Dr. Branch for attending today.
Magic developments in this class, 622, many trajectories of watching people go from first time paralyzed with fear about what's going to happen to polished professionals a few years later and giving presentations. So we always thought that was a leg up for the students here when they go job hunting. They've got practice of, actually occasionally answering a tough question. I was infamous, or maybe famous, for having the first question, and it was about the title. Try to give you a softball. Why'd you pick that title? What about this title? That kind of stuff. But there's some really nice moments where you just look up there at the end when the students are getting near done, and you say, man, this student is really good. It's terrific. And it's, sort of a semi-friendly audience, except for the faculty, of course, who have to be the ease. But it was really nice. It's a wonderful life that you can luck into sometimes. Great students, great people, great colleagues, really terrific. Go get them.
Thanks again, Marc.